that you would think he'd say the things around us we perceive through sight. Again, images we have to see and have this power of imagination to recognize them as images. If you'd think just things around us we'd see by sight. It's a puzzle. Why opinion? I want to come back to that in just a moment. But let's first talk about the cave, very briefly. The third image. Right after the divided line, beginning of book 7, Socrates turns to this image of the cave, probably the most famous thing in Plato's Republic. And he says, I'm going to offer this image as an image of our education and our lack of education, or our uneducation. So you know the deal. There's a cave, there are prisoners in this cave that are chained to their seats facing the back of the cave. This should feel very congenial to you right now, right? So exactly as you are. You're not chained, but you're sort of chained, right? You have to swipe in when you're chained there, right? So here you are in the cave, facing the back. Now the difference here is in this cave, there's a fire in the back of the cave behind a little wall, and behind that little wall there are these mysterious people who are carrying these artifacts. And the fire casts its light on them, casts shadows on the back of the cave, right? That's why I never use PowerPoint, right? Because it just feels too cave-like to me. But that's what's happening in the cave. So then somehow a prisoner gets freed and even gets dragged up out of the cave to the outside world, is blinded by the light outside, has a really hard time, eventually his or her eyes adjust, can see things in puddles maybe at first, like a reflection of a tree, then can eventually see the things around him, eventually looks at the stars, eventually at the sun itself. But what happens if the prisoner goes back into the cave for some reason? Well, again, like anytime when we go from light to dark, our eyes find it hard to adjust. We're all filled with darkness. He's stumbling around. The other prisoners, what are they doing? They're playing this contest, this game, as to who can name what shows up on the back wall fastest or most accurately. This guy stumbles back in and he's just lost. So what do the other prisoners think? They think, oh man, it is a bad idea to go outside of the cave. Look at what happened to this guy. He became an absolute idiot. So if he was to try to take anyone else up out of the cave, Socrates says, the prisoners would revolt, they'd probably try to kill him. All right? So, again, let's break down the image a bit. It's an image, so it's an image of something. So what's the cave an image of? I'll give you the answer for this one. This is a little tricky. Socrates says, keep in mind the other two images, the divided line and the sun. And he says the cave, actually, is an image of the realm that's revealed through sight. That's how he describes it, i.e. the visible realm. Now, anything puzzling about that? He says the cave is an image of the visible realm, the realm that's revealed through sight. Strangest? What's that? Yeah, exactly. The cave is really dark, right? That's a very defining feature of the cave, is it's very dark. Yeah, there is some light, that you see these shadows and such, but you would think this is hardly a description of the visible realm, right? You think that would be the outside of the cave, the realm outside of the cave, where the prisoner gets to see stuff. So this is a second puzzle that I want to hold on to, along with that puzzle about the meaning of the term opinion. All right, so the cave is, it says, an image of the visible realm. The realm outside the cave, then, to follow his earlier images, would be an image of the intelligible realm, he says. Right? So we've got these two parts. We can build a proportion again. The cave is an image of the visible realm, just as the realm outside the cave is an image of the intelligible realm. So what's the point of all this? Well, Socrates says one point is it's setting up the education of the philosopher. Education is not having people pour stuff into you, the way that maybe a lecturer might try to do, but rather to have you turn your soul away from what's becoming to what is. That's education. Right? It's nothing else. You want a description of education, if any of you are education majors or the like, or anyone teaching, that's what it is, according to Socrates. It's a turning around of the soul, a reorientation of the soul. So that's one point. Another point is something we've touched on before, that he says, look, once the philosopher gets up out of the cave, what's he want to do? He just wants to stay up there gazing at the stars and the sun and so forth, and doesn't want to return. It's like he's gone to heaven, the isles of the blessed. So again, we see that the philosopher goes in this isolated individual direction, and Socrates says, if he's then to return to the city to rule, he has to be forced. So here's another sign of what's going on here. The most just city, if it's to be the most just city, it must force the philosophers to rule. Does that sound just? Well, no, generally we distinguish justice from force. In this case, Socrates says it's only just if the city has raised up the philosophers, fed them, taught them, and so forth, so they have an obligation to pay it back. But we've already seen, there's practically no city that would happen in. So in every real city, the philosopher is part of the city only by compulsion, only by force. You saw this at the beginning of the Republic, when Socrates was going merrily on his way, and Polemarchus and the others said, you're coming with us. We will force you. That's the only way that this philosopher joins any real city. Finally, in this image, as I said, it sets up the turn to education, those subjects like arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, harmonics, astronomy, the rest of Book 7 is all about. Sounds wonderful, right? Oh, it's very, very lofty, very, very striking, what the philosophers are going to be studying. Only one problem. Does this sound at all like what, say, Socrates, the philosopher, spends his time doing? Does he spend his time kind of gawping at the stars and the sun? Does he spend his time doing, geometry in the ground or figuring out astronomical equations? Well, I mean, we don't see every moment of his life, but from what we see, he does not do this. Right? This is not the Socrates that we hear about from Plato, Xenophon, and others. So something else is going on here. And that something else is what makes me want to take one more look at these three images, and particularly these two puzzles that I mentioned. So I've left out a whole host of things. Socrates left out a whole host of things. I'm just going to focus on these two puzzles. The first puzzle was the one I mentioned, that Socrates says the cave is an image of the visible realm, even though it's really dark. All right? So what on the divided line occupies the visible realm? If we go back to that second image. Well, the visible realm, you'll remember, was cut into images and then the things around us. And we saw by what conditions we perceive those. We perceive images by imagination, and we perceive the things around us by pistis, by faith, belief, or opinion. That's the second puzzle. I want to connect these two puzzles. So not sight. So we don't see the visible world through sight, even though Socrates had said earlier that we do see it through sight. We see it through imagination and pistis. How do we make sense of this? Like, did Plato just fall asleep somewhere, between the latter part of Book 6 and the beginning of Book 7? And did he just kind of blunder? Oh yeah, we see the visible world through sight. Oh no, you see it through opinion. I think you probably have all had enough of a taste of Plato to know that's not the kind of mistake he makes. So confronted with this, we have to make sense of it. I think that this is a suggestion for how to make sense of it, that what Socrates is hinting at here is that our human way of being in the world, as distinct from dogs and cats and trees and so forth, is to opine, to believe, to trust. In other words, we trust that a dog is a dog. We trust that a tree is a tree. We trust that a chair is a chair. Now, we can make mistakes. We get fooled all the time, right? So I was once driving in a kind of backwoods of Colorado, and I was like, wow, look at that big dog running across the street up there. It turns out it's a bear, right? So like a little bear could look like a big dog, right? And vice versa. At Thanksgiving this year, a friend of my sister's brought her dogs to Thanksgiving, and one of these dogs was taller than this lectern, right? So it's this wolfhound Malamute thing. So a dog could look like a bear could look like a dog. We get fooled all the time by our very capacity to see images and things, right? But basically, I think what Socrates is hinting is that we take the world on trust. We take it on belief. In short, our perceptions of the world are never pure. It's never like just being itself pours its way into my eyes. Becoming comes to me through my eyes. Our perceptions are never pure. Your perceptions of whatever you perceive are always shaped by opinion, always shaped by your beliefs about dog and bird and tree. They're shaped by your language. They're shaped by your trust. Now then, if we accept that hypothesis, that suggestion, what shapes our opinion? What shapes our beliefs? Where do you get those from? Suggestions? Thoughts? Yes? Education. Education. And who does the educating?
Storytellers.
Storytellers, for sure, yeah. So wonderful stories, like when you're little, your parents read you stories and so forth, watch movies, that's part of education, right? Anything else? Who else educates us in our beliefs? Yeah, parents are like the big ones, right? Right from the start, continually shaping us in our beliefs, our thoughts, the way we speak, even the way we move, act, etc. Other teachers, priests, rabbis, etc. In other words, the community, right? Whatever community it is that we grew up in, that teaches us our beliefs. I think you could put it in one word, the city, to use Plato's word. The city teaches us. And by putting together the image of the line and the cave, by putting together these two puzzles that I've mentioned, the cave is somehow the visible realm, and the visible realm is the realm we get through opinion or belief, you can come to the conclusion that the cave is the city, right? The cave is the community, right? We grow up in it, we get used to it, and gosh, if someone comes along and tells us that what we believe is not right, we get uppity about that. We get pretty disturbed. Now then, who teaches the city its beliefs? That's the last question I have on your handout there. We actually have heard an allusion to it already. Who teaches the city its beliefs? Anyone? It's a little harder. It's a little more behind the scenes, maybe behind the wall. But the suggestion of the storytellers that was mentioned, or the way that I would put it following Plato, the poets. The poets, and think poet, not just like, writing sonnets, but poets like Homer, Hesiod, poets who kind of tell the story of a people like Virgil, poets that you're going to be reading or have read in core. The poets teach the community its beliefs about the most important things. These are the mysterious people behind the wall in the cave, holding up their artifacts being their poems or the expressions in their poems. Those are the poets behind the wall. So, if that's the case, you might say, all right, so yeah, the cave's the city, the political community, poets are back there behind the wall, but the real point is to get out of the cave, right? To get to the intelligible realm, to be gazing at the stars and so forth. Yes, that is what the image teaches here. But consider also what it says. What is that realm outside the cave? Not figuratively, but literally. What's the realm outside the cave? It's the realm of the visible things, right? Puddles and trees and other people and so forth. In other words, the would-be philosopher or scientist who thinks that somehow she can jump out of the cave to be into the world of truth by itself is mistaken, according to Socrates. You're still within the visible realm, which means you are in the realm of belief or trust or opinion. The only way out of the cave, so to speak, is not to rise above yourself, but to reorient yourself, to turn the soul around even to itself, right? For the soul to face itself, not think it can somehow get up and above. In this turn, if you have experienced it or you're beginning to experience it, it is very liberating, right? To suddenly see everything as completely the opposite, as upside down. But it's not completely liberating. Right? It's not completely liberating in this way, that it doesn't give you a complete, comprehensive view of the truth. So I would say that the Republic, just as it teaches that the just city is impossible, so too the heights of wisdom remain inaccessible, according to these images. We have to learn to live within perfect cities, right? It can be a big disappointment. But especially for those of us who are politically motivated, we have to learn to live with imperfection. So too, for those of us who are really, jazzed up about philosophy, we need to learn to live with love of wisdom. Philosophia, not wisdom itself, which is Sophia. We need to learn to love. We do need to learn to love, but we need to learn to live with this love of wisdom. And that can be extremely delightful, not just frustrating. So I summarize it this way then. In books 6 and 7, Socrates impresses Glaucon with the belief in an image of philosophy. He impresses him with the belief that the philosophic life somehow just transcends politics. The philosopher is above all of that stuff. But that is only an image. It's a beautiful image, a noble image. It's the image that Glaucon wants for the just life. doing your own thing, completely independent, not hurting anybody else. But it is only an image. The truth is not so simple. The visible world is still the cave. There's no such thing as pure perception. The city's teaching, the poet's teaching, shape everything we, quote, see. And most importantly, the poets teach us that we live in this world. These opinions are partial. And Socratic philosophy, which you could also call political philosophy, Socratic philosophy consists in questioning these opinions. And it does so because each opinion promises, it's partial, so it promises some sense of a whole, some sense of a big picture. But it doesn't deliver. And so philosophy is pursuing that promise without attaining it. And it remains a love of wisdom. That's why Plato wrote dialogues rather than treatises, right? To keep that sense of the love of wisdom always in front of us, of not having a final answer. And it's the deepest reason, I think, that Socrates orients his young friends and us to politics, to the city. Not only to see justice, because after all he says there's something higher than justice, even, but rather to face these perennial questions about the soul, about life, about the very being of the world, and for some of us to experience the joy, not just the frustration, but the joy that pursuing those questions inspires. All right, I'm not too far off, 10:36, so I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So, shoot, this is like very fast, there's some very difficult material, so what questions do people have on what I've said, or challenges, right? I mean, because this is not the be-all, end-all on the subject of books 6 and 7, but yes, please.
In what realm, given the idea of the divided line in the cave, in what realm would Plato or Socrates say that God exists? Like religion, are they in the cave? Are they an idea that we have that is false, or are they like a truth that is harder to learn?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for anybody who didn't hear it, where is God in these images, and specifically the image of the cave? Well, I made kind of a provocative suggestion that in the case of the sun and the divided line, because they get kind of lumped together, that Socrates is allowing us to believe that the good is God. And in fact, that's how many interpreters afterwards take it, that Socrates has held up to us a kind of rational God in the form of the good, and the philosophers look up to that God. I've made the suggestion that that may be more for Glaucon's sake, and for us to question, than to take as like, I'm going to bow down in front of the good. In the cave, it's harder to say, right? The sun is outside, that would be the analogy to the good, and the philosopher is going to go stare at the sun. And the sun, yeah, does a lot of nice things for us, but does it really care about us? I don't think so, right? So the cave is the place where we actually feel some sense of community and caring, but there's no direct analog of God right there. At most we have what the poets say about God. That might be a very good place to start with. Thank you. Other questions?
I'm wondering if you buy the idea that the majority of people can be philosophic. Because at least the way I see it is like maybe the majority of people don't have like the intellectual bandwidth to like grasp this stuff and explain it. But I always feel like everyone can like get at the truth the same way, whether they can explain it different words or not.
I think that's a great question. I think you should live with that question. And I would say that what Socrates describes here of the reorientation of the soul, that's really what your question is about. So if we accept for a moment that that's education, that's philosophy, that's the beginning of philosophy, is trying to turn your soul around from everything that it was oriented to the opposite, then ask how many of us could do that. So for instance, we see at the beginning of the dialogue the discussion with the father and the son, Cephalus and Polemarchus. Very, very close, and loving in a way. What does Socrates do there in that early part of the discussion? He engages Cephalus at first because, he's a polite yes. But basically he says to him, so, you're kind of old, what's it like being nearly there? And Cephalus answers, and Socrates keeps pressing on that. Finally Cephalus says, I gotta go, right? I gotta go do my sacrifices and such. In other words, Socrates gets rid of the old guy as quickly as he can. Socrates cuts through the family. Right there? So one way to form your question would be, to what degree, if philosophy requires a complete reorientation of the soul, to what degree could we tolerate, To what degree would we find it desirable to turn against everything that we loved up to that point, right? And turn to something completely different? Parents, children, and so forth, turning around. That's where it starts. The rubber hits the road and starts to hurt. Or be liberating. Depends on its relation to children and parents. So,
I have time for one more.
okay, so one more question. Yes, please.
So you mentioned that Socrates argues that we should be comfortable with living in perfection. Then why doesn't he entertain the possibility that maybe there is no such thing
As the good itself. So you're saying, look, it sounds like you're saying Socrates is saying you have to live with imperfection, live with some of the disappointment. So why does he hold up the good here as an absolute? Again, I would say live with that question and think about, for instance, what would it mean to not live with that? So, for instance, the idea of the good or the form of the good, it's the most preeminent of these forms that Socrates talks about, right? These eternal things like the form of a dog or the form of a human being or the form even of a chair. They sound pretty weird, right? Like, where are these forms? How is the form of human being in me and you and all these other people here at the same time while being one thing, right? So they sound strange, they sound almost easily dismissible, but then think about what happens if you do dismiss them. If you say, for instance, that dog is whatever people say dog is, right? And maybe people over in Persia say dog is one thing, and people in Greece say it's another. Dog is just whatever people say dog is. Well, some people say, like, there's stories of a dog being like a demon or an evil omen. There are other people who believe that dogs are gods. So if there's nothing that goes beyond what people say, the world can become an extremely confusing place very, very quickly. And so I think that Socrates is putting the forms out for us, not for us to bow down and say, oh, there's the last perfection, I found it. But rather to force us to say, how do I make sense of this world that does seem to come to me in certain kinds, but as soon as I try to figure out how those kinds relate to everything around me, I face some very, very thorny problems, including this one about the good. For instance, how can there be good without bad? Right? I was thinking of that today driving in the commute. Usually people commuting are awful. They're evil to each other. Why? Because everybody wants to get himself or herself ahead first. Right? Everybody's jostling. Well, on a snowy day like this, everybody is focused on not getting killed. Right? So people are actually kind of nice to each other, let you in. Why is that? Because we have a common enemy. We have a common enemy, the weather. Right? And we're nice to each other. So we have a good because we have a bad. Okay? So to your point, how can there be just a good by itself? So I would say stick with that question. What do you think? All right, well, I know I got to let you leave, so it was fun to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.